Hi, and welcome to the second part of my 2-year review of our solar power journey. This time, it's all about the numbers. In the first part of this 3-part series, I walked through our system setup in detail and highlighted some of the lessons learned, as well as some of the issues we've experienced since having had our system installed in late July 2022. This time, I'll dive into the figures in detail, looking at how much power we've generated and how well it compares with what we might have expected. I'll also look at the economics, covering installation cost, import and export figures, energy tariffs, bill costs, and ultimately payback expectations. Without further ado then, let's get started. Before reviewing our first 2 years solar generation, it makes sense to first consider what we should expect from our system. I won't run through the specification again here, as I covered that in detail in part 1. But if you haven't seen that video, and if not, why not, you can pause here and get a quick overview. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos on solar power, you'll know that I like to make use of the JRC PVGIS tool, from which we can see the projected annual output for our 4.5 kilowatt peak panel array is 3,329 kilowatt hours. The panels are not quite on an exact east-west layout, with PVGIS indicating that we should get slightly more power generated by the east-facing bank of panels at 52% of total than the west-facing bank at 48% of total. So, tabulating the projected output from PVGIS, as shown in the first row, and then adding the actual output figures running from August 22 through to July 24 as per the next 3 rows, we can then do some analysis. Taking the first 12-month period, August 22 to July 23, we see that we generated 3,606 kilowatt hours, which is 108% of the PVGIS projection. However, if we then look at the second 12-month period, August 23 to July 24, we generated 3,146 kilowatt hours, which is only 95% of the PVGIS projection. Now, whilst the output from the second year of operation was significantly lower than the first, in fact down 13%, averaging those figures over the whole 2-year period gives us a notional annual average of 3,376 kilowatt hours, which is within 1% of the PVGIS projection. At this point, it's worth a quick look at the month-by-month figures, as they are perhaps more illuminating as to why the annual output has varied by so much. Plotting the monthly output then from August 22 to July 24, we get this chart, with months in 2022 shown in orange, 23 in blue and 24 in green. The PVGIS projection is shown by the red line. Filtering year by year, we see we got off to a fantastic start in August 22 with output more than 21% above the projected figure. The remaining 4 months were either pretty much as projected or just a little bit above or a little bit below. Moving on to 2023, the 2 standout months were May and June, with outputs more than 23% and 26% above the projected figures, respectively. Again, the remaining months were generally at or around the projected figure, with the exception of March, which was 15% below projection. And then we come to 2024, and the tale of woe that it has been. February through to May were all noticeably lower than projected, with only June exceeding the projected output, and then only by 7%. July then proceeded to wipe out that gain, closing out the 2-year period with another subpar performance. Although technically outside the 2-year review period, August and September have continued much in the same vein, suggesting that the whole of 2024 has just been very poor, at least up here in the northwest. The January to September 2024 output totals 2,820 kilowatt hours against a projected figure of 3,028 for that period, which equates to a gap of 7%. All a bit disappointing really. Well, here's hoping 2025 is going to be better. Before we continue, just a small request. If you're enjoying this video, please do hit the like button as it helps me reach a wider audience. And consider subscribing if you've not already done so. Thanks. Okay, enough about projected and actual output. Let's take a look at how much electricity we've imported from the grid and on those sunnier days, exported back to it. On this chart, I've gone back as far as the start of 2021, as it gives a useful illustration of how our electricity consumption has changed following installation of solar. Our household circumstances haven't altered during this roughly 4-year period, so this should give us a true indication of the impact that installing solar has had. With blue indicating grid consumption, or import if you prefer, and red-orange indicating exports back to the grid, the first thing to highlight is that our grid consumption is showing a general downward trend, as per the dotted line, which is probably to be expected after installing solar. If we next look at the Q1 figures pre-solar, i.e. January through March for both 2021 and 2022, and the Q4 figure, i.e. October through December for 21 only, we get an average quarterly grid consumption of 1,527 kilowatt hours. Then, looking at the comparable quarters post-solar, i.e. Q4 22, Q1 and Q4 23 and Q1 24, we get an average quarterly grid consumption of 1,121 kilowatt hours. So our autumn and winter quarters have seen an average reduction of 400 kilowatt hours each following installation of solar. Who says solar panels don't work in the winter? Turning our attention now to the spring and summer quarters, Q2 and Q3, i.e. April through September, we get an average pre-solar quarterly grid consumption of 1,035 kilowatt hours. This is reduced to 606 kilowatt hours post-solar, again resulting in an average reduction of our grid consumption of about 400 kilowatt hours per quarter. Now, the obvious question is why haven't we seen a greater reduction in our grid consumption during Q2 and Q3, given the additional levels of solar generation we experienced during these periods? Well, of course, the primary reason is that the additional solar that we've generated has in the main been exported back to the grid, rather than contributing to a further reduction in our grid consumption. Excluding Q3 in 2022, when we were experiencing delays in getting set up for export, we've averaged exports of about 607 kilowatt hours per quarter. Adding extra battery storage capacity would allow more of that excess solar generated electricity to be stored and used at a different time, which should result in a further reduction of our grid consumption. Well, at least that was my thinking and justification for installing a 4.8 kilowatt hour US 5000 battery module in October 2023. However, I'm not sure it's as simple as that, but more on that later. Right, so we've looked at our solar generation and what that means in terms of the amount of electricity we've imported from and exported to the grid. Now to the really interesting stuff. What effect has all that had on our bills? Well, we've been a customer of Octopus Energy since early 2019, having switched to them to take advantage of the, at the time, very competitive fixed price energy tariffs. Anyone remember them? In the same way as for the previous section then, I've gone back as far as the start of 2021 to chart the price we've been paying Octopus for our electricity ever since. Before we look at the unit rates, however, it's worth a quick look at the standing charge, which we can see has more than trebled during the last 4 years. This has resulted in the standing charge now becoming a significant element of the overall electricity bill during those peak solar months. In our case, averaging around 40% from April to September this year. But there's not much we can do about that, apart from perhaps exporting more back to the grid and using the resulting payments to offset the standing charge. So let's look at the unit rate history over that same time frame. At the start of that period, we were enjoying those low fixed rate tariffs, and when those came to an end in early 2022, thanks very much Mr. Putin, we were moved onto the standard Octopus flexible rate tariff. Note that for some of that time, we were subject to the Energy Price Guarantee Scheme, like most everyone else in the UK. Then, in May 2023, we switched to the Octopus Flux tariff, which we've been on ever since. I think most people are probably familiar with the Octopus Flux tariff, but in essence, it's a tariff targeted at consumers who have solar and battery storage installed. It's an import and export tariff optimised to, in theory, give the best rates for consuming and selling energy and supporting the grid during peak periods, or at least that's the marketing speak. In practice, what this means is a cheap rate between 2 AM and 5 AM every day when it makes sense to import energy and charge up your batteries, and a peak rate between 4 PM and 7 PM when it's the optimum time to discharge your battery and export surplus energy back to the grid. As the chart shows, the three rates have varied pretty much in sync over time, with the current differential between the standard day rate and both the cheap flux rate and expensive peak rate being around 9.7 pence per kilowatt hour. By the way, if you're thinking about switching energy supplier, I have no hesitation in recommending Octopus. Apart from a couple of minor hitches when we were trying to get our export set up, which turned out not to be completely their fault, we've found them price competitive and pretty responsive when we've needed them. If you follow the link shown earlier, quoting Mint Loris 102, and sign up with Octopus Energy, we'll share £100 between us. That's £50 each, which will help me keep making these videos. Thanks. Okay, so knowing how much energy we've imported from and exported to the grid and the tariff we're on, it's time for the big reveals. What's been the impact on our electricity bills, and what is our current payback projection? Well, as you've probably already guessed, I love a good Excel chart, but to be honest, I was disappointed in this plot of quarterly bills over the last 4 years. I think it's very hard to form any conclusions from it, which I think is primarily due to the significant variations in tariffs that we've seen during this period. It's all just numbers. So I had another stab looking at it quarter by quarter for each year. There's still 3 columns that look out of kilter, but I think these can be explained. Q2 22 was when we came off the fixed tariff, coincident with Vlad charging into Ukraine, resulting in a 60% jump in unit rates. Q4 22 and Q1 23 saw unit rates jump by a further 20%. What conclusions then, if any, can we draw from just looking at the bill figures? Well, just that our Q2 and Q3 bills, i.e. from April through to September, for the years 23 and 24, have been significantly reduced by us having installed solar. All well and good, I hear the solar cynics shout. When will you break even? What's the payback period? So, how to calculate the payback period? Well, there's no point reinventing the wheel, so having watched Gary Does Solar's video on tracking your solar installation payback, the method he outlined seemed as good as any to me. By the way, if you've not already done so, I do recommend you take a look at Gary's channel, as there's a treasure trove of great videos on all things solar. Having followed the link in Gary's video, we see there are a number of different spreadsheets. I chose to use the third one in the list, i.e. Solar Payback Craig Harris version 4. You should watch the video for an explanation of how the spreadsheet works, but in essence it enables a comparison of the cumulative electricity cost with solar, including any capital expenditure, versus the cumulative electricity cost without solar. Simples, as the meerkats might say. The first thing to do then is to enter any capital expenditure, which in our case consists of the initial installation cost of just under £11,000, together with the cost of the US 5000 battery module we added in October 23, to which we then add the actual electricity cost for each month up to the current date. This is the net cost taken directly from my Octopus bills, i.e. what we've been charged for, less any payments for export. Note that any data you enter into the spreadsheet is shown in red, with all other figures being calculated automatically. Next, for each month in turn, we enter the total amount of electricity we've used in kilowatt hours, the standard import rate per kilowatt hour, and the dead weight, that is the daily standing charge. And once you've done this, the spreadsheet will generate a straight line estimate of the break-even point, which in our case comes to 11.61 years, corresponding to a payback date of 8th of March 2034. Wow, that feels a long way away. But does it come as a surprise? Well, no, not really. Back in one of my early videos, I took a stab at calculating what our likely payback period would be. And just taking a very simplistic view of £11,000 installation cost and about £1,000 per annum of solar value, I came up with a figure of 11 years. Now, as we've seen, tariffs have been all over the place in the 2 years since we had the system installed. So it's my view that they're probably going to be the most significant determinant of what our ultimate payback period will end up being. But at least this spreadsheet gives you a means of tracking it. Returning to the payback chart, we see the green line kicks up noticeably in late 23. This, of course, corresponds to the £1,400 investment in another battery module. The obvious question then is, what would the payback period have been if we hadn't done this? Well, as you can see, it comes down to 10.3 years, corresponding to a payback date of 15th of November 2032. That's almost 1.5 years sooner. So, was investing in additional battery storage a bad idea? Taking it at face value, the answer would seem to be yes. But what do you think? Now, whilst fretting about my payback period would seem to be a pretty pointless activity, there are probably a couple of steps which might help reduce it. The first is to be a bit more aggressive in how we use that additional battery storage. So far, we haven't been doing any forced discharging during the peak rate period between 4 and 7 p.m. Instead, just using the batteries as a means to import power at the cheaper rate during the early morning. I won't go into the reasons why we haven't been doing that, but if, for example, we chose to export around 4 kilowatt hours each day, that could result in payments of around 50 pence per day, £15 per month, or £180 per year. Those figures assume current rates and replenishing the discharged amount fully during the early morning flux rate period. Another strategy would be to see if we could increase our solar generation capacity as cheaply as possible. With that in mind, earlier this year I outlined a plan to install an additional 2 panels on our flat garage roof in this video. Initial rough calculations suggested that we might get around £200 additional solar value each year, which should have a significant impact on the overall payback period, although rates have dropped a little from the 30 pence per kilowatt hour ballpark figure I used at the time. Of course, these actions are not mutually exclusive, and thus a combination of export payments and additional solar capacity could result in something like £300 to £400 benefit per annum. The final thing would of course be for the sun to shine a bit more in 2025 than it has during 2024, but maybe that's just wishful thinking. What about you then? Do you track your system performance? Have you tried calculating your payback period? What method do you use? What charging and discharging regimes do you have set up? And do you change these throughout the year, say between winter and summer, or what? Please do post a comment, as I'd be interested to learn what others are doing. Okay then, I think I'll call this one done. Hope you found it of some interest. If so, please do give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on my DIY panel upgrade coming soon. If the missus will ever let me put the paintbrush down, that is. Thanks for watching, I really do appreciate it. Hope to see you again next time. Cheers.